What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode. Get comfy here in the shade. Nice soft spot on the river. So today I was out birding this morning, obviously, and I figured I would do another wildlife tutorial, and this one I want to gear towards all birding and more specifically shooting small birds. So the last wildlife video I did talk about birding and wildlife in general, and I gave a lot of good tips in that. So if you haven't seen that yet and you want to check it out, links right here. But there's a big difference, to me at least, between shooting big birds, birds in flight, shorebirds, that kind of thing, things like this, than coming out here to your local woods or your local creek or whatever, or even at your house and shooting those tiny little flappy birds. There's a big difference in the bird behavior and the bird size and the techniques that you would use to get good shots of the little flappy birds versus the bigger birds. So that's what I want to kind of go over today, is show you guys how I do that and how I approach shooting these little flappy birds out in the wild without baiting or anything like that. So the first thing, and this is really important for all wildlife and birding in general, but it's super important for this style of birding, and that is know your birds, know your wildlife, do your research, because you have a lot harder of a time just walking around and hoping to get lucky finding some bird that's this big, you know, up here in all this chaos. Especially it's starting to be summer now and the stupid leaves are starting to come out, and it makes birding like this much more difficult. So know your bird's habits and where they like to, where they're breeding, where they're eating, where they're sleeping, where they're foraging, all that kind of stuff. And to do that, the best resource that I use is called eBird. So it's ebird.org, and I just pull it up here and I come down to the area that I want to look at, and I zoom into the hot spots. So these markers here are where people have identified birds, and then they have checklists, and you can hover over them and see however many species it shows. And the green dots are the smaller amount, all the way up to the red dots are the most amount. So you definitely want to look for those yellow, orange, and red dots for the most amount of species that you can find. So then once you find your hotspot and you know the area that you want to go, then what I like to do is go look at the checklist, and I like to see what kind of birds are there in that area and what kind of bird that I might be interested in finding. And the cool thing about these checklists is that if you click one of them, then you can go straight to the bird and see all its info and pictures and all of that stuff, and that'll really help you decide if that's something you want to try to photograph or not. The other site that I use a lot is called allaboutbirds.org, and I believe that it's run by Cornell Lab, and they have bird books and bird apps and all that stuff too. But they're really good. If you just type in a bird's name into Google, usually the first website that comes up on that bird is going to be allaboutbirds.org. And that website is a lot like eBird. It has a lot of information on the bird's habits, the bird's pictures, the different types, you know, whether it's an adult male or juvenile or female, breeding plumage, all of that stuff. So that really helps with identifying, and it helps me figure out what I'm looking at and if I want to photograph it, or if I get a photograph and I don't know what it is, then I can go back and look it up later, and that's really handy. And then on my phone I use an app called Audubon Birds. There's a bunch of bird apps, but that's the one that I like the most. You can record your sightings, you can search for birds, you can do all that kind of cool stuff, and it will also allow you to search for birds based on your GPS, on your area, and it will kind of show you what's in the area based on the time frame and the location that you are, and that is a really big help. So it helps whittle through, you know, hundreds of species. That way you're not searching for something that is not going to be here based on demographics. All right, enough of that. Let's talk about some settings. So the same basic principles of wildlife apply here. You want a faster shutter speed. I still like to either shoot in shutter priority or manual mode. When I'm dealing with tiny little flappy birds, I usually prefer shutter priority. So on the Canons, I switch that over to TV, and that will allow me to just control my shutter, and the camera will control everything else. Another thing I like to do is either, and I know a lot of people aren't going to want to hear this, but I either put it in auto ISO, or I put the exposure compensation to like plus 2/3 or something, maybe even plus 1 depending on how backlit the situation is, because the hard part about dealing with Flappy Birds and exposure is that the bird is so small in the frame. And sorry, there's like Blackhawks flying around here, and Blackhawks are super rare. There's a nesting pair right down a few hundred meters down this creek, and they're really cool to see, and I got distracted. Anyway, so Flappy Birds are really hard to deal with exposure because they take up such a small amount of the frame. And the chances of you getting close enough to fill the frame are they're not great out here, you know, without blinds and without bait and all that kind of stuff. A lot of these birds are real timid, and they're really active, and just filling the frame with them is very difficult. So like the few times that I have filled the frame with them, like this kind of stuff, that just requires like hiding in trees and having lots of patience and knowing exactly where that bird's going to be and just waiting. So I waited for weeks for this shot. I come here every day and wait for weeks to get a shot like this. So that's how I deal with my shutter speed. Your aperture is typically, if you're shooting in manual, it's typically going to be wide open because you need that faster shutter speed. With these kind of birds, with little Flappy Birds, especially if they're bouncing around and stuff, you generally want a shutter speed of at least 500th of a second, you know, maybe faster. If they're not moving around that much and you need the light, then maybe you could drop it down a little bit. That's a scene by scene case. But generally speaking, you want something fast because these little Flappy Birds are fast. All right, so let's talk about focusing. So the next thing that I pay attention to when I'm trying to shoot Flappy Birds in the face is focusing points. So with bigger wildlife and with wildlife that's moving and it's larger, or birds in flight or anything like that, I tend to do group focusing and have a larger area of my focus points selected, so we'll have an easier time tracking them. But out here, when you're in the woods and you're trying to get little tiny Flappy Birds, that just doesn't work because your focus can hit anything else but the bird. So I like to do just one of the more center points that's the better cross type, and just have one single point and keep it focused on that. I usually try to keep the center point too, because the center one is usually the best in most cameras. It's the fastest. And the other thing is, you don't always want your birds in the center, but you know, for composition and stuff like that, to make an interesting image. However, you are likely going to be cropping. I pretty much crop almost 100% of my Flappy Bird shots to some degree, even if it's just to move them around the frame. I still want that center autofocus point because that's going to be the best one to really lock onto that bird. Because the last thing you want is to be trying to shoot a bird and then you hit the branch right next to it, or the branch behind it, or the branch in front of it, or whatever, and then you miss the bird and then it takes off. And that's it still happens all the time. You know, as good as these cameras are for focusing, shooting little Flappy Birds is still extremely difficult, but that will help minimize it, and that will help you lock on to your bird a little bit easier. Alright, so the sun was killing my shade at that last spot, so I had to keep moving on. Alright, so let's talk about a couple other things that will help you, and these might seem silly, but they are kind of important. The first thing is timing. Along with knowing your birds and all that stuff, is know when they're active. And usually a good rule of thumb, not always, but a good rule of thumb for a lot of wildlife stuff, like I said in the last one, is shoot early in the mornings and late in the evenings, you know, sunrise, sunset, that kind of thing. That's usually when a lot of these type of birds are active, along with a lot of other wildlife. So that will increase your chances. Another thing is that I kind of broke today is pay attention to the colors that you're wearing. Colors are kind of important. Definitely, obviously, if you want to be super hardcore, camo is like the best you can do. I'm not always that hardcore, but I usually do try to dress in natural colors, drab, that sort of thing. Today I actually had on this like super bright blue shirt, and it's like 75, almost, it's supposed to be 80 degrees today. But I just, you know, I spaced the blue shirt, and so I just threw this black fleece on over, and I'm really hot right now, but you know, birds definitely recognize colors that stick out of their environment, and if you have that problem, then they are less likely to stick around when they see some bright blue blob walking through their scene or something like that. Do you hear that? I don't know if you can hear that, but that was the Black Hawk that I was talking about. I'll show you guys it. There he is. Oh, he's flying right over me. Holy shit. Wow. I'll be right back. Whoa. Black Hawks are awesome. So that's definitely not a small flappy bird. That is a ginormous raptor. But gotta do what you gotta do, right? So yeah, colors are important. Dress in drab, dress in camo, dress in natural colors, that sort of thing. Movement is super important. I've covered this in other videos before too, but you really don't want to be moving around that much. And if you have to move around that much, you don't generally want to move directly towards the wildlife. You want to kind of zigzag, or just, because if they think that you're not approaching them directly, you might have a better chance of them not taking off. But that's a great thing about doing your research and knowing their habits and knowing if this bird is skittish or where they are and what kind of trees they like. So if you find what kind of tree they like if I know that I want to get tanagers and warblers, then I know that they're going to be eating insects out of these cottonwoods and these Russian olives. So I'm going to go find one, and I'm just going to sit down and I'm going to hang out and be real still and just kind of wait for a while. That's the last biggest tip I have for you guys, is just patience. Wildlife photography is like one of the hardest things you can do, not just because you need good gear and all that stuff, which definitely helps, but because most people just don't have the time or the patience to come out here day after day and sit here for hours on end waiting, especially for these little flappy birds, especially without using baiting techniques or blinds or anything like that. They do have like portable blinds and stuff. If you want to carry a portable blind into a place like this and just pop it out, they have little pop-up ones. You know, I don't have one, but there have been times where I've considered it. So that might be an option, you know. That'd definitely help your waiting, but you still have to find the right spot to put it. Alright, so that's enough for me. I know I probably made this video a little too long as per my usual, but hopefully that gave you guys some good insight into what it takes to do this different type of bird photography and shoot little flappy birds in the face. If you guys have any questions about anything that I went over or didn't go over concerning the settings or the techniques or anything like that, leave those in the comments below and I will definitely answer them. So here's the images that I got. Hit that like button if this video helped you out. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.